Well, welcome everyone, and this is a very important subject that we're talking about this afternoon, and we're grateful for the participant we do have, and because the session is recorded, my understanding is it will be available to many others who might have an interest in looking at what we've done today. And to start with, Hope, will you manage the introduction of participants? Because you know the people with Red Wind who've already spoken, but can you call upon the other folks to introduce themselves and tell us why you chose to participate in this session?
Yeah, I believe it's Jovita. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but if you could go ahead, and we'd love for you to engage. You can always turn on your microphone as well, but really address any questions you have. And in the chat box, or if you want to speak, let us know where you come from, what job title you hold, and any questions you have about ICWA, so we can address those today.
Oh, hi, everyone. Okay, let me turn my video on. My name is Jovita Belgard. I'm from Wenke, Sleda, and Turtle Mountain, Chippewa. I'm with the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, and I work with Native youth on the Native Love Project. I just recently left the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women in New Mexico. And so, you know, the work that we do has everything to do with ICWA. And so I thought that this would be a wonderful session to attend. So thank you for being so open to questions.
And I think we wanted to, just have like an engaging conversation, and really use Lucille as an amazing resource for us today. And we're honored to have her here. And so any questions that do come up, I have a few questions, just like frequently asked questions, if we kind of run into a little area where we don't have have a question or have a topic to discuss. Do you have any specific questions right offhand?
I don't really have any questions about ICWA in general just yet, but I'm sure as like it continues, I might. But thank you for offering.
And Lucille, I'll let you go ahead and kind of explain why ICWA was passed and a little bit of the history and some of the main people who helped make ICWA happen.
I'm happy to do that. And we would also, when Hope and I were talking about this session and how best to utilize everyone's time, we certainly acknowledge the preparation of this PowerPoint that is on the screen. And I assume the whole PowerPoint will be available to those that might view this, this recording. But we thought, rather than, because there's so much content in each slide, we thought we would not use the PowerPoint per se, but encourage all participants to read through it, because there's a lot of information here. But we thought this would be a much more valuable session just to have dialogue. So we don't have very many participants. So I wonder if and already I've forgotten, Jovita, is that it?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. If you're comfortable with that approach, or you would prefer to go through the PowerPoint.
I don't have a preference. You know, I'm open to just seeing what you all would like to do.
Okay, well, we can start the way that Hope and I thought this might go, but we were expecting more people to participate. So with the change in time and whatever, it obviously was not to have very many people here. So let's go ahead and start as Hope and I thought it would go. And then if we need to go back to the PowerPoint later, we can certainly do that. And we appreciate I think it was Amber who put this together for us, and we very much appreciate that. A background of the Indian Child Welfare Act begins with the traumatic history, of course, of Native people in our own land. And, you know, and the most prominent period of that tragic history is what is now known as the boarding school era, when there was concerted effort to take children from their tribes and put them in a residential setting, oftentimes very far from their tribal homelands, and try to make them basically non-native people in the process. And so that was thought to be the policy of the federal government to really totally assimilate Native people. And of course, it thank goodness didn't happen in totality because of the resilience and the strength of Native people in our own land. We're still here. We have 574 federally recognized tribes, and we have many more unrecognized, state recognized and unrecognized tribal communities as well, some of whom are seeking federal recognition. And so the cultural strength of our people through our tribal communities is still very strong, but we still are dealing with sort of the aftermath of the boarding school era. And it became so terribly obvious to a non-native national organization in the 1970s that they went out and talked to Native people in tribal communities around the nation to really get information on exactly what was going on with their children and losing them to the then public child welfare system. And that organization was the Association on American Indian Affairs, headquartered in New York City. And at the time, there weren't even any Native people on their board, but they really were concerned about what was happening in Indian country. And so they did this major research effort and then reported it to all who would listen. And one of the particular listeners was a United States Senator from South Dakota, James Aberesk. And he, under his leadership, the United States Senate had put together what they then called the Senate Select Committee on Indian Affairs. And one of its major focus points was to deal with this situation and hold hearings on what was happening to Native children in the public child welfare system. And the outcome of those hearings was putting together legislation to begin to address what was happening and try to curb it, if not stop it. And what resulted was the Indian Child Welfare Act, passed by the United States Congress in 1978. And I was privileged to actually be working in Washington, DC at the time. I went there as a political appointee in the presidency of Jimmy Carter and worked for the director of the Anti-Poverty Agency as a special assistant. And just turns out the young man I was dating at the time was one of those attorneys who worked under Senator Aberesk. And so I got a little bit of input into what went into the Indian Child Welfare Act. And we were all somewhat disappointed that, you know, it didn't have the total strength that they were looking for. I just had a little bit to say, but of course I was not shy about saying it. But it was passed by unanimous consent by the United States Senate and became federal law. And the upside of ICWA is that it exists. It's a piece of federal legislation focused at state child welfare systems to better address the sovereign rights of tribes and Native families. And the downside of ICWA, it had no teeth. If states didn't comply, they weren't going to lose any money that they secured through Title IV-E of the Social Security Act, which is the big funder of public child welfare, or any other manner of outcome if they did not comply. And therefore, for many, many years, states, by and large, across the nation, did not comply with the Indian Child Welfare Act. But over time, through led by principally by advocacy from the National Indian Child Welfare Association, there came to be a lot more attention on the Indian Child Welfare Act and what needed to happen to ensure that it was recognized and abided by. And in recent years, it's come to be recognized that everything that is good child welfare practice in the Indian Child Welfare Act actually should be happening for all children, not just Native children. But wouldn't that be a glorious day if that happened, that all children were treated as it is required under ICWA. But for Native children, it's still an uphill climb, but it's a very important climb, and it is good, strong, good child welfare practice. And the Casey Family Programs that I worked for many years has come to call it, and others have now agreed, that ICWA is the gold standard of child welfare. And that kind of helps a lot of states and counties to come to the table and be better listeners about what's in the act and what they can do to comply with it, which is all about family reunification, if at all possible, and also recognizing and being responsive with culturally responsive services to make these families stronger so that they can safely reunify with their children. So it's very exciting that the BIA, and I forget which year it was, actually issued guidelines to help states and counties better address compliance with ICWA. But because they weren't mandatory, those that really cared read and followed, but they didn't have to. But in 2016, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and I forget how many years that is since 1978, but they finally issued regulations, federal regulations that govern the Indian Child Welfare Act. And states and counties do have to pay attention to those regulations. And that just helped the whole movement across our country for better compliance with the Indian Child Welfare Act. But it's a very complicated piece of legislation. Lawyers often understand the requirements under the law much better than us lay people who are more children's services type folks than lawyers. But it is a very important piece of legislation. And ICWA training is especially needed and valuable to really kind of peel under the legalese of it all to really get to what I consider the real basics of the law. And that is to do everything you can through active efforts, not reasonable efforts, under the Adoption and Safe Families Act, which was passed, I think, in the year 2000. But active efforts, do everything you can to reunify these families. And also then the placement preferences, and that's outlined in the act. And there's some flexibility in that because there are levels of placement preference. And so, obviously we advocate for the strictest one, which is to go to family of the child who is declared ICWA eligible, but not Um, But if the family is mixed, if it's a native, one of the parents is native and the other parent is not, as long as it's placement with family, it can be the non-native side as well as the native side. And that's, been clarified in recent years too, because the essence of it is family, keep families together. So I've been yakking a lot here. Are there any questions?
I just wanted to comment on active efforts, because I think in a lot of advocacy that I've done, that was something we really had to point out in the cases, is that they were just providing reasonable efforts. And we had to keep telling them, with an ICWA case, you have to provide those active efforts. And some examples is providing culturally appropriate services. And that's something here in the Colorado area that they were kind of struggling with. And now that we have all the services such up in Denver, and we have more native specific services here in Colorado Springs, they're actually using that. But I think that's also something to point out as well.
Well, and I think some of that is attributable to the passage of the Adoption and Safe Families Act. I think it was in the year 2000. Is that really clarified, what caseworkers needed to be doing in seeking services for families caught up in the child welfare system. And over time, it became somewhat of a back and forth whether ICWA superseded ASFA or the other way around. And of course, a lot in state practice advocated that ASFA and reasonable efforts was the same as active efforts, which we know it's not. But in recent years, I think the tables have turned, and there's general recognition that ICWA does supersede ASFA if it is an Indian Child Welfare Act case. And so that's part of why that's kind of, the reliance that many caseworkers did for many years is, as long as we're doing reasonable efforts, we're good. And that, of course, is not the case with ICWA. And as Judge Bill Thorne from Utah Court of Appeals, who's now retired, in his ICWA trainings, he always talks about, you do everything you can. That is active efforts. You bend over backwards for these families, and you might want to do something reasonable for other families, but under ICWA, it's bend over backwards. So other questions or comments?
I always like to think of too, especially when a woman comes in from a domestic violence or some type of traumatic crisis, that they're not only trying to navigate that crisis, they also have to navigate the Department of Human Services system, or the CPS, whatever's involved with their children. They've got to figure out their situation with having a home or being homeless. And there's a map, I'll try to look for it and get that sent out as well, that shows a navigation system, the map of like all the different type of hoops and things that a mother or a father in this instance has to go through to meet all these guidelines. And without transportation and a job and a home, it makes it really difficult. And I think that's where with an ICWA case, there's really an advantage, they have to provide that, really try to put the active efforts in for transportation, for childcare, to make this family, help them reunify and
Exactly.
be successful. So
well said. That's absolutely the case. Doing whatever it takes to help reunify the family. Absolutely. Any other comments from anyone? Are you reminded of any stories? Hope, you're a storyteller.
we have Amber too that can
Yes,
also share her
that's
story.
right. Well,
But I
and
think
others may have some too.
I think it's important for those of the participants who may be joining later, but who's covered by ICWA, and how do we know if a child is eligible for membership of a tribe? What if your child isn't? I have a story from a recent case that I was working on, and she was a member enrolled, and her daughter, the child was born out of a rape situation. And she had also been in the system as a child. And so she just had everything stacked against her. She was a young mother. Her daughter didn't qualify to be eligible for enrollment. And it was really tough to see because there was no tribal intervention, there was no tribal help, ICWA was not able to be a part of her care. And so I've had those cases as well. So who's covered by ICWA? It's anyone under the age of 18 that's unmarried and is either a member of a tribe or eligible for that membership. And to find out if are able to be enrolled, you'll contact your tribe. I believe at the courthouse as well. They'll have you fill out documentation and they'll get it sent to the correct tribe, do all that for you and help you navigate that system.
Well, actually, it's caseworkers who are responsible to do that, not the court.
We had helped as an advocate program. I had really helped her. We didn't have, the caseworker was really against her case, and it had drug on for a while. And we see that a lot. We couldn't get a lot of response from the caseworkers, and that's why these outside programs are so important. So that
well, and I think that even qualifies as an active effort to really go above and beyond. Mm-hmm. And it's just good child welfare practice for caseworkers to establish a relationship with folks at the tribal level while they're, the attorneys in Colorado, the county attorneys have to send the notice to any tribe that are likely to be where a child might be enrolled. And of course, it's the responsibility of the family to name who those tribes are. And then it's up to the county attorneys to send those notices. But caseworkers can establish and should, if it's good child welfare practice and active efforts, to establish a good working relationship with tribal child welfare people. And some tribes have better capability in that area than others. And so, it's just important to know a bit about the tribes that you're talking with and learn from them, coordinate with them, find out, particularly in the age of COVID, with virtual services being available, are they offering anything at the tribal level that could be utilized by families caught up in the public system? Sadly, through even in more recent years, this national statistics show that Native children are still overrepresented in the public child welfare system. And so with all the work we're doing, it's better, but it's still not far from perfect. And so there's a lot of ICWA trainings that go on. I'm part of the one for the state of Colorado, and I'll just put in a plug. Again, it's not perfect, but the state of Colorado, in my experience here, has come miles and miles and miles forward in recognizing that they were not complying with ICWA and that they could do a lot better. Can they still do better? You bet. But they're now offering statewide training to county caseworkers, and it is mandatory for the supervisors of those caseworkers to take that training. And it's a written training. I don't think it's as comprehensive as what the National Indian Child Welfare Association offers, but it's still a written training that can be taken online. And then there's a 4-session video component on cultural humility, active efforts, placement preferences, and what's the 4th one? I'm blanking. But anyway, I'm privileged to be one of the resource panel members for those sessions. And we get some pretty good interaction. So I'm hoping that that's helping to help Colorado do even better with ICWA compliance. So other comments or stories to be shared?
I just want to say thank you, Lucille, for sharing with us today. I think for me, ICWA has played a part in my life in multiple areas. So I can share a little bit about that. And then if you just have any responses, I mean, not that, I mean, ICWA has affected my life in multiple generations. So when I look back at my grandmothers and I think about how ICWA impacted them, I think about my grandmother being taken out of her home at 5 years old and placed in boarding school, giving my great grandmother 0 rights to her 13 children. And having 13 children and having them all slowly taken away from you, the impact that that had on her and her life, and then my grandmother's life, to be told things growing up in an assimilation camp for children, that being Indian is bad, that her religion and her beliefs are heathenism, that just she wasn't allowed to practice her religious freedoms until 1978. And I was born in 1983. So, I mean, that puts her at 48 years old before she could go to powwow, before she could go to sweat, before she could really, I mean, she may have went, but those things were illegal. So it was 1978 before she was legally allowed to practice those things. And then just the stigma behind that, not being Indian enough, being too white. Myself, I'm very light complected. My grandmother married a non-native man. She did that because that's what she was taught in boarding school. Don't marry another native. Don't produce brown children. That's bad. Like, you need to marry a white man and get far away from the reservation. And she did those things. She didn't move back to the reservation until 1984, just a year after I was born. So I grew up with powwow and sweat and Sundance because of her trying to find her way. And I'm just so grateful to that. But I came still from a broken home because my mother had to grow up without her mother. So she didn't know how to be a mother. And those things impacted her in a different way. Her not being able to connect with me and then turning to things like drugs and alcohol to cope with not having good parents, because those parents grew up in assimilation camps, unable to be parented and loved and comforted. So then my mother didn't know how to do those things. And it took many years, and we are still repairing that damage in our own family. I grew up then between my mother and father's home until I was about age 11. And then I was placed in and out of foster care until I was 15. And then I was finally homeless and on the streets. And it wasn't just me. I grew up here in North Dakota. I grew up on the reservation, between actually several reservations, mainly MHA Nation, Standing Rock, and Cheyenne River. I'm enrolled Cheyenne River, but seeing my cousins, my peers, growing up in foster care, being threatened with, like, first of all, we're taken out of alcoholic, drug addicted homes. And then if we do anything wrong, we get punished for that. So it's like, oh, you're just being a regular kid, while you are going to be taken from this foster home because you were out 10 minutes past curfew, and we don't put up with that here. So we're going to send you off the reservation to a lot of times kids got sent to like group homes, correctional centers, those type of things, for doing regular teenage things that if they were in a non-Indigenous outside of the community wouldn't be happening to them. They'd at least be able to be in their families. So even still, we're moving kids off the reservation, putting them somewhere else. And it's just a hardship on the children and the families to be reunified. And then I also honorably mention is my other grandmother, whose 2 small children out of 7 children, she had 7 children, her 2 oldest children were taken out of the home at ages 1 year old and 3 years old, a little boy and a little girl. My father grew up never knowing them. His mother he grew up with a mother with a broken heart. And I got to meet my aunt when she was like 40 about my age now, 40, close to 40 years old. But her brother that was 3 when he was taken, he died at 18, basically due to a broken heart, because the foster parents, adoptive parents that he was placed with, they didn't want him. They didn't love him. They had been wanting to adopt a little girl, and they got my aunt, but they never wanted the son. But they took both children from the home and placed them with it was a minister and a school teacher in a nearby community. So my grandmother grew up without her children, and they just forcefully came in and took these kids away. There were no drugs, there were no alcohol. They just took her children from her. So, I mean, to think about where we've come from and where we are now, yes, things are healing and getting better, but from the standpoint of being this child and living it, I still see things going on. I'm still in North Dakota. I have a nephew that was just recently, and I mean recently within the last 16 years, he was adopted out, and his parents are Native people, and his mother just abandoned him, and the state just proceeded with an adoption and did not get permission from the tribe. And now he's struggling tremendously with identity issues. And it sucks to see this continue on for our people. And so any efforts we're making, I just hope that those of you on the call, and I know we just have Jovine, we appreciate you being here today. And I've also been to your reservation here, Turtle Mountain. So it's great to have you here today. And we appreciate everyone, your information, knowledge. If anyone else, Jovine, if you have anything you want to share with us, we'd appreciate hearing from you. And I'll just kind of stop there, because I just want to show that, I mean, the generational and historical side of ICWA and how it impacts us, our children, myself, our communities. It's been such a, I was also a part of Casey family, but as a child, not as a social worker. So, I mean, I feel like there were a lot of great things that Casey family did for our communities, but it was still, there were still lasting effects. I mean, I didn't get reunified with my parents. There was very little reunification efforts with me and my mom or with me and my father. And then by the time I was 15, it was just like, oh, well, you know, we haven't heard from, they just let me go. Like, really, I was just like released from the care. I even went in and talked to my social worker. I'm like, I'm homeless right now. Like, he's like, oh, well, you're staying with a friend, right? And I'm like, yeah. He's like, well, that's good. I mean, your friend's mom can verify you're staying over there. And I'm like, yeah, like I don't know if they just didn't have homes or he just didn't want to do the paperwork, but I never had any assistance for 3 years. It was just like, bye.
Goodness. Was that Casey Family Programs that acted like that?
No, I got transferred from MHA Nation down to South Dakota, and they placed me from foster care to living with my aunt, my mom's sister.
Okay.
And my mom's sister was an alcoholic, and she just was doing the same stuff my mom was doing. And I was just like, I don't want to be here. So I ended up just staying with friends, and I went and talked to the social worker, and they were just like, it's really not a lot we can do about it as long as you're safe and you have a place to stay. I mean, it's like they didn't want to do the paperwork or the hassle of having to report my aunt or anything. And I know I'm not the only kid, you know, it's sad that it has to be that way.
Well, to clarify, Casey Family Programs is both a licensed foster care agency as well as a private foundation. And I worked for the private foundation part. But they only took children into long-term foster care. And what the process was to decide that, I have no idea. But we made some adjustments, and we started working more in systems change than really supporting long-term foster care. And now they don't have any children in care anymore. They're all about just systems change, hopefully for the better, but we'll see. And they still have an Indian child welfare office that's located here in Denver, but they're focused more on tribal court work these days. But I will forever be grateful to them for laying down the money to found the Denver Indian Family Resource Center. You know, they don't support it anymore, but you know, without them, I doubt we could have got that done to provide culturally responsive services to counties in the 7 metro counties of Denver. So, interesting story. My goodness, what hardship and historical trauma.
Absolutely. And it's not just me, you know, that's the thing is like so many of our Indigenous children and families have endured. And I'm so grateful to programs like the Casey family, to Red Wind, and other organizations that are trying to bring awareness and information to these topics. So
Well,
thank you again, Lucille, for being
it
here.
also speaks to your resilience. I mean, you know, in my graduate studies, that was an area that was of particular interest to me, was children who have been abused can often be so resilient to overcome the worst parts of that experience. And, you know, and I think that's a testament to so many Native people, that despite the hardship, terrible hardships, we're still here. And are there scars? You got it, but we're resilient people. Jovita,
Absolutely.
do you have anything to share with us?
I just really appreciate all of your stories and all the wisdom that you're sharing. You know, my grandmother went to Indian boarding school as well, and like just how it affected our family. Like my grandma speaks fluent Tiwa, and my grandpa spoke fluent Tewa, or vice versa. My grandpa spoke Tiwa, my grandma spoke Tewa, but they didn't teach like my parents' generation because of boarding school, and like how hard it's been to like trying to learn language in like different ways because we weren't raised with it. Like or just like I have a lot of friends who've been affected by you know, policies, not just like boarding schools, but like I have friends who've been like their families were taken or adopted out to white families, and they don't know what community they come from. They know that they're Native, but they're detribalized. And like people talk about like identity politics a lot, and about like, oh, it's if your people claim you, but like we also talk about healing and like how, you know, if we were able to get those people back, we would claim them, you know, we would invite them back, but we don't know where they went. And it's just like all of that pain and hardship. Like I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and a huge gravesite was found here over by the Indian Public Cultural Center. And this, you know, I posted about it. My friends and I created this memorial, like, you know, spot, and, you know, it created a lot of media attention on social media. And then until we had said like, hey, like this park, you know, is a graveyard for Indian children, did they pay attention to it? Like there used to be a plaque that commemorated that spot. And, you know, in recent years it was removed. And it's a park where, you know, people are playing on, you know what I mean? Like they're having barbecues, and, you know, people are playing on that. And it's, you know, it was very like hard, you know, to process. And when we, you know, started posting about it online, the city was like, oh, we're going to investigate now, and we're going to get together this group. And they got together all these people from community to investigate this like Indian gravesite of all these children, like our first children that were removed and taken from our families, you know. And there are tribes all over New Mexico that were at this boarding school that had passed. And when they had invited all these different people, researchers, you know, advocates, different people from different organizations, but when it actually came together, they were more concerned with like making themselves look good than like truly like trying to find justice. And like, you know, the community, we were saying, hey, you need to find out who these kids were and find out who their families were. So if they want them back, they should be able to take them back, you know, or like do what they want with them, you know, their tribes, their people. And then, you know, some article came out in the Albuquerque Journal maybe a couple months ago, and they were saying, oh, you know, this was run by the Presbyterian Church, and it wasn't as bad as those other Indian boarding schools, and this was a good one. And they basically just tried to make themselves look good and like, you know, not share information with the public. And so when I think about ICWA and I think about the history of ICWA, it's so important. Like it's touched so many lives. And I think about like how it can be used to help advocates. And I also like worry about the court cases right now, like all these different cases that are challenging ICWA around the nation. And in New Mexico, we recently passed the Indian Family Protection Act because of all the challenges that were happening with ICWA. And we're just like, we can't take this chance. And so the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women and several other organizations and legislators around and tribes came together to make this other act happen. But it's just, I don't know, it's frustrating to like take steps forward and then, you know, to slide back, I guess, you know, and it's, or when, you know, the ICWA exists and then it's not used properly, you know, like people aren't following the law the way it should be and it's not enforced. And it's just, it's a headache. And especially like you think about like colonization and how like, you know, yeah, back then it was assimilation policies, but now it's like CPS, right? CPS is coming into our, like, you know, native families, and they're the ones that are taking our kids away and putting them somewhere else. And they don't even know that ICWA exists or that it has existed or that they need to follow it. And I don't know, I just like, so learning more about like the changes, I think is really helpful to offer that to advocates, to offer that to community. So those community supports can really work together to continuing to improve that situation.
Well, on the good news side of the points you were just making, there now is an ICWA court in Bernalillo County. Are you aware of that? It's the judge is a Navajo woman. I don't remember her name. I can find out, but that's something that's been happening in the last, particularly the last within the last 10 years, is the rise of ICWA courts around the country. The first one was in Los Angeles County, and then it was several years later that they founded one in Duluth, Minnesota. That's very, very good. And then two now here in Colorado, and about 2 or 3 years ago, Bernalillo County. And there are, the last number I heard was about 16 ICWA courts around the country. And of course, they are established in areas that have quite a few ICWA cases. And because that's such a complicated act, it really is amazing that courts can be formed that just do ICWA cases. And the outcomes, much better. I haven't seen recent research on outcomes, but I saw some preliminary research 2 or 3 years ago that definitely supported the establishment of more ICWA courts. It doesn't cost anything to establish one. You just need a judge that's particularly interested to address that. And we're fortunate here in Colorado, we have two, one in Denver County and one in Adams County, because we're a state supervised county administered system in Colorado. There are several others in the nation. New Mexico, I think, is a state administered system, but you have that one court in Bernalillo County. And also, I'll have to look at that report that the Interior Department put out on boarding schools to see if there was more than one in Albuquerque. My father attended the Albuquerque Indian School that was basically located where eventually the Aledo Pueblo Council became the owner of all of that land there. And so I don't know what the situation was about a cemetery there, or if what you're referring to is actually another boarding school in the Albuquerque area. Have you seen?
That's the one. That's exactly the one. The Albuquerque Indian School.
Well, it was more than Pueblo tribes who went there, because my father was a full-blood Pawnee and he was there. Alan Hauser was one of his classmates, the renowned sculptor, and he's of a tribe in Arizona. So it was much broader than the Pueblo tribes of New Mexico in
Absolutely.
terms of students that were there.
The cemetery that they found is actually behind where the Indian Public Cultural Center is, across the street. And it was a cemetery site, they said, from the 1890s to early 1900s. So, you know, they say they don't have very good records from back then. And they're trying to say that, oh, they just passed from disease, or, you know, all these other things. But I think it's really just to escape culpability, like, because the land is no longer under, like, that specific part of land is a city park. It's owned by the city now, instead of you know, the All Indian Tribal Council of Governors. Because it's not owned by AIPCG anymore, like, the city, you know, is responsible for making, you know, responding to this. So they have the Albuquerque Indian Affairs Department handling it, but they're really just trying to put, like, plain token in right now and put a good face on it. And
Well,
like,
at least you have that now. When I was growing up, that wasn't there. It was just the All India Pueblo Council. So, you know, kind of look fairly on the system, that it's better than it used to be. And you just, as residents there, need to put pressure on them to do the right thing. Because the good news is they're there, because that wasn't the case many years ago. So it's, you know, it's complicated and frustrating, no doubt. But that's clear. I'm surprised they have as much information as they have been able to gather, thanks to Secretary Holland, who is a member of the Laguna Pueblo, that she's really put resources into doing that research. And, you know, it's going way back, and, you know, a lot of records have been lost, because we've got like 3 or 4 of those boarding schools in Colorado. I didn't know we had that many. I thought we only had 2. So it's complicated and often very frustrated, and definitely very, very sad for unmarked graves of children. You know, it's in many ways not acceptable, but it is the reality, and we must cope with that and manage the sadness of it, and particularly, you know, unmarked graves where we don't even know who those children are. But we're doing what we can, and we got to keep at it for sure. So.
We do have somebody else who joined us, Lucille. Her name's Christine. Christine, if you'd like to introduce yourself and let us know where you're from, we'd appreciate it. And if you have any questions, please ask. We have a few minutes remaining.
Make it in here. Good morning. My name is Christine Cooper Smalka. I work in Fairbanks, Alaska. I live in North Pole, Alaska. I work for Fairbanks Native Association as a prevention specialist, and I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, Christine. Do you have any questions or anything you would like to contribute to the conversation on the Indian Child Welfare Act?
No, I'm just finding it very interesting. You know, the graves and everything, and the boarding houses, you know, it's just so much in the news now. And so, yeah, I find this, you know, not interesting, but, you know, you hear a lot of it and you've seen a lot of it, and, you know, it's just how things are going, I guess. I mean, you know, everything's just so interesting to me right now, and very informative and learning experience.
What part of Alaska are you in again?
I work in Fairbanks, Alaska, which
In
is
Fairbanks.
yeah, the second largest city in Alaska. But I live outside Fairbanks, about 25 miles out in North Pole.
Wow, okay. I have family in Delta Junction. Do you know where that is?
Yes, I actually have family there too.
Small world, small world.
Yep.
Okay, well, thank you for being with us. One thing that has come to my mind that I think is always good to talk about is a lot of states are concerned that tribes don't do enough under ICWA, but we really need to clarify that ICWA is, excuse me, is focused on the public child welfare system, not tribal child welfare systems. And tribes, it's about their sovereign right as Indian tribes, and they have the power to intervene in these cases, but to be part of the cases, they don't have to formally intervene. And that's why the public approach to this ought to be establishing relationships for the best interest of the children that they're dealing with, learn the most about their cultural heritage, and establish a working relationship with tribal child welfare workers to bring to bear culturally responsive services to the best that state and county caseworkers can do. That's part of active efforts. But I think a lot of people say, well, why aren't tribes doing more? Well, the problem is not tribally created. It is publicly created. And that's why the focus of this act is on state and county systems. So that's often, you see that question come up a lot. And I think, Hope, do you want to talk about the whole business of who determines membership in the tribe?
Yeah, I was just going to piggyback real quick off what you're talking about before.
By all means, please.
And I was just thinking, like, as advocacy, how do we really, I mean, what tools can we use? How do we support ICWA advocacy? And I think a big way is just having that intergovernment, building those relationships, you know, having tribal, state, everything be connected and on the same page. And also the court relationship with tribal court, or using coalitions to help even create new laws,
Well, we're particularly challenged though in Colorado because we only have 2 federally recognized tribes and we don't see their children in the public child welfare system. So it's a bit of a more of a challenge to establish those tribal connections, because the closest of any of these tribes, it's a 7-hour drive going north. And so, they really have to put out extra effort to establish those relationships. Most of the children in Colorado's public child welfare system are Navajo. And although the Navajo Nation has purchased land now in Colorado, and hopes over time to become more involved in tribal state relations in Colorado, they're not there yet. And so, I mean, it's, we're doing it across lines, and that makes it more challenging in Colorado. Other states, in a sense, have a greater opportunity, like in New Mexico, the 19 Pueblo tribes and the Apache, Dulce, or the Jicarilla, and the Mescalero, and then the Ute Mountain and Southern Ute aren't that far. So it's a little easier in New Mexico. But in Alaska, how many tribes are there? It's over 200. So the state of Alaska is trying to do better, but they're way behind in terms of really affecting working relationships with the villages that are also tribes. So
another thing too is I know ICWA it's not mandatory for data collection. I don't know how, or if you have recommendations or input on that, or how we could start getting more data.
Well, again, that's a state responsibility. I mean, they can work with the feds. The feds really, through their AFCAR system, I don't think really have done that much about capturing appropriate data in relative to ICWA. And in state systems, like in Colorado, the trails, there's a little bit that caseworkers can enter, but a whole lot more could be done about that. And So it's always a work in process, unfortunately. And then the data system kept by the Colorado Department of Human Services is one data system, Trails. The courts have a whole separate data system. And so that's, particularly challenging for the two ICWA courts in Colorado. So for now, they keep their own data, but it isn't all that robust. So it's, data is a huge, huge issue. So you're absolutely right.
Well, and I'm just going to quickly review how do we, I know time is out here, but you had asked how do we know if our child or if somebody's eligible for enrollment, and it just depends on the tribe, as each tribe has different requirements for eligibility. Mine, you do have to be a quarter or 25% native blood, and I guess to really understand the requirements.
But the most important point is tribes define their own membership, and it can change over time. And so, county and state workers should never assume they need to establish that connection to get the most up-to-date information about tribal enrollment.
Right. Contact the tribe directly, or even reach out to the Bureau of Indian Affairs.
I wouldn't do that because you probably won't get an answer. Certainly not a quick one. So. But also we need Native foster parents. I mean, we complain about states and counties, but how many Native people step up to be foster parents? So we really need to kind of, look within ourselves. These are all of our children, and we need to be there for them. Advocacy is great, but direct participation is even more important. Anyway, any other parting thoughts as we end our time together here today?
I did put some links right in the chat that are good resources, as well as Lauren will be sending out the PowerPoint to you guys as well, so you'll have a copy of that.
Thank you.
And I know we wanted to mention, I've got to pull it up.
Well, real quick, while you mentioned that, I mean, as a former foster child myself and as a parent, I just want to say that I think that it's really important, not only for Native foster parents to step up, but for Indigenous parents and aunts, uncles, grandparents, and children to be educated on healing and resiliency. And resiliency isn't just a word, it is us being there and supporting each other, both our aunts and uncles and parents, in giving them some forgiveness for what they've been through, and also supporting that younger generation as they continue to struggle and need our support and need assistance in different ways. Like, we can't just foster parents get resources, they get help, they get to go to classes, they are provided food and money, and it's the parents at the end of the day who don't already have the money, they don't have parenting classes, they don't have, they miss out on so much trying to just cope with the trauma that they themselves have been through. I mean, I've seen mothers with 7, 8 children at the age of 25 years old, and they don't know how to parent their children because they were never parented. So, I mean, again, giving that forgiveness and understanding that resiliency is more than just a word. It's really being that person that supports someone and cares for them. And that resiliency is always changing. It was, for me, one time it was my grandmother, another time it was the foster mother that was there for me. And then another time, yet again, as an adult, it's been friends, it's been former foster kids, and it's been the loss of those foster kids and seeing their struggle that has given me my resiliency. And so it isn't just the trauma, but it's those people that really loved and supported and cared for me. And all of you out there doing the work as advocates, as you have people stepping into your office, you're caring for them, you are their sister or brother, and you're helping them at their moment of need. And we appreciate all of you. So thank you guys.
Oh, well said. The power of extended family.
Absolutely.
It's awesome. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you. We'll close out here. Oh, I see Hope put up our information on how to reach us if you have additional questions or comments, feel free to reach out to either of us. We appreciate you and thank you for your time this afternoon. You have
I
closing
will.
words, Hope?
I will forward that June is National Reunification Month, and the Nebraska Indian Child Welfare Coalition is doing a 9-week a training on caring for our own program, is what it's called. I'll send that to Lauren, and she can get that sent out to you guys as well.
Great. All right.
Thank you.
Well, thank
Hope
you,
and Lucille.
everyone.
We appreciate you guys both for sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us. We thank you guys for coming on today. And I know we had a little bit of technical issues, but you got through it. So thank you again, ladies. You did great.
Thank you all.